Hey everyone, I'm glad to see you here for part 2 of Beyond He Said, She Said, The Art, Architecture, and Purpose of Effective Dialogue. I'm Jay Kenner. I'm a New York Times best-selling author with over 100 books to my name. And this is a distillation of a workshop that I gave at a Romance Writers of America conference a few years ago. I got a lot of positive feedback on it. I think it helped a lot of people. It's a long workshop, and so I've broken this video down into multiple parts. This is part 2. If you missed part 1, I would suggest you go back and start there. That being said, let's dive in. We ended last time with talking about how dialogue delivers exposition. And it does it in a much better way than simply writing out what you want the reader to go away with. You want the reader to absorb the information, to understand it, not to simply be told it. Remember, dialogue is the showing, or is one way to show, in the age-old adage of show, don't tell. So before, in our first session, we talked about how dialogue can deliver facts regarding things like relationships, backstory, technical information, all sorts of information that you might want to get across. But in doing so, you have to remember that there are also rules of the world. You want your dialogue, or you want the exposition within your dialogue, you want it to be invisible. You don't want to info dump. You don't want to set up one character saying to the other, well, well, Timmy at the well, well, Timmy, the reason we're going to the store is because old man Murray told his sister Sally 25 years ago that blah, 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 blah. That's boring. You want to work things in organically. Ideally, you want to add conflict to your story through dialogue. Conflict that is set up in the overall arching plot of the story, or just conflict between the characters who are talking. Or add action, or merely entertain. Better yet, try and do all of the above in your dialogue. So let's drill down just a little deeper into that. I just said that one of the ways that you can put your dialogue to work is by having it set up and enhance conflict. So think about it. When you've got your back and forth between your characters, that back and forth needs to have a purpose. There's a reason you are writing those words inside the quote marks in the first place. But to keep it interesting, you want that bit of dialogue to have its own internal conflict. You want it to rise to a resolution that moves the story forward, because dialogue is a tool, remember? So you want to put it to work. Also, keep in mind that dialogue doesn't have to be the words that are said. It can also be the words that aren't said. So for example, in the image, you can see that one character is saying, I love you. The other character strokes her cheek and says, we're going to be late for the party. What he doesn't say is, I love you too. And that raises a story question. Why? Why doesn't he say that? Maybe he's preoccupied. Maybe he doesn't love her. Maybe he's thinking about something else. Maybe he's planning a murder. We don't know. It could be creating conflict between these characters. It's definitely creating a question. But there's hardly any lines of text there, and yet something is going on, and that something is important. Let's take a look a bit closer at the idea of conflict and how it can come out through dialogue. These are some examples from 2 books in the same series, paranormal romances that are dark and edgy. You can't actually get these books anymore because I am rebranding them, but they make the point well. So in the first one, in the top bit of dialogue, were you spying on me? He forced his voice to stay flat, with no hard edges. And the response is, sometimes I watch and don't see. Sometimes I don't watch and see more than I want to. All right. We know that there's conflict between them just from this tiny little snippet of dialogue. She's been spying on him. we know he's going to have to do something about it, and we want to know why. All of that comes through in just those few lines of dialogue. It's also an example of distinctive voices. Her sort of sing-song, almost poetic-like approach to language is different from his harsher tones. So in this case, you can identify who the speaker is without tags, and that's a goal you should always have in your dialogue. If someone's just saying yes or no, maybe you'll need a tag, but if they're actually talking, it's good to have their voice be distinctive. You may still want to tag it just to make sure for sure, but ideally get those voices as distinctive as you possibly can. In the bottom example, there's conflict again. There's a fight. The wrong people suggests that there's a more overarching story conflict, but just the nature of the fight has conflict in this exchange. So we've got a world issue and then a distinct issue with regard to this fight. Also, we have exposition here. So if you can parse it out, we know it's a paranormal from the fact of the book. Freak and puppy dog are clues that they're attacking a werewolf. And maybe you get it and maybe you don't, but that doesn't matter. It's going to be revealed later in the story, and it makes the dialogue more authentic. No one in that world is going to say, he's a werewolf, so we need to beat him up. But the dialogue makes sense and gives the reader clues. So the bottom line is that dialogue entertains, but it doesn't just entertain. It serves a multitude of purposes, and you want to make sure that you put your dialogue through its paces. If we want to really drill down, we can break dialogue down into two types. There's direct dialogue. For example, I'm sorry. And then someone else answers, there's nothing to apologize for. Or indirect dialogue. I'm sorry, someone says. And then in the book, instead of having a reply, we say, he told her not to worry about it, then let her out the door. We know that he said something because it says, but we don't know exactly what he said, just the effect of it. So which is better? Well, we want to show, not tell, right? So the direct dialogue is going to be better. Or, to be more accurate, direct dialogue is going to be better than indirect, unless it isn't. There's certain times when you actually are going to want to go with indirect dialogue. So here are some of the exceptions to the direct is better rule. If the reader's already seen it, for example, quote, and then Sally got in his face and told him he was a dweeb. Then Marcus shoved her against the wall and called her a whole bunch of names. If we've already seen that happen in the book, we don't need to listen to our character describe the whole fight all over again to someone else. If the reader doesn't need to hear it again, for example, quote, blah, 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 the plan, okay? Question mark. Okay, said John. Absolutely, said Fred. Or the better choice would be, they all agreed, indirect dialogue. As we already talked about, technical details are often better addressed in indirect dialogue. Some actual dialogue, then something to the effect of, he explained how the satellite worked to pinpoint the bad guy, and then back into regular dialogue again. If you don't need them, you can, as they say in Seinfeld, yada yada those details. Or if you want to skip time, that often will work better in indirect dialogue as well. Quote, you look lovely tonight, close quote. They chatted about the weather and the menu while she worked up her courage. Quote, so, are you married? Question mark, close quote. We don't need all the little banter back and forth. Maybe we do. Maybe you do want that. Maybe you want to show just how nervous and mundane the conversation is. But in that case, it's a choice. It's perfectly legitimate to go with indirect dialogue in those kinds of situations. You can also skip if it's inappropriate to the genre. For example, if it's sex in a young adult book or something, or cursing in a middle grade book. So things like that, where you're going to just let the thought hang, or you're going to cut off the quote before you get to the dirty word, or you're going to just summarize, a sexual encounter. All of those are legitimate reasons to tell rather than to show. So let's dig a little deeper into what is good dialogue and what is bad dialogue. So good dialogue has certain characteristics. It fulfills the purposes that we've talked about so far. It's presented properly on the page. You want it to sound realistic, but not necessarily too realistic. You don't want the various stops and starts that I've made recording this lecture, for example. You don't want your dialogue filled with ums and uhs and strange words and twisted back phrases. You want your dialogue to be distinct, to have a rhythm and a flow. That's not something we talked about earlier. I had it on a slide, but I forgot to mention it. But sometimes you say the words in a specific way because that's the way your voice works. That's a quality of the work that you do and how readers know that this is a work by you. You don't want to overdo it, but certainly that is a legitimate reason to say or not say something a certain way. You don't want to overdo it though. But certainly words can have that musical quality to them. You want your dialogue to not be on the nose, and if you don't know what that means, we'll talk about it. And you want your dialogue to be tight, which also ties back to the whole sounding realistic but not too realistic. All right, so that's good dialogue. What about bad dialogue? Well, bad dialogue has no purpose. It has bad punctuation and lots of tags. It's too realistic. Every character sounds the same. The words are clunky or wooden. It's what we call on the nose, or the dialogue is just sort of hanging out there. So we've already talked about the purposes for dialogue in that they establish action, character and characterization, that they can set up or refine your conflict, and they can provide exposition. In addition to that, we're going to now talk about realistic dialogue, subtext, and rhythm. Dialogue should sound real, but you don't want it to be too real. There is a really excellent book called The Theory and Technique of Playwriting by John Lawson, and I found this quote in it that I think just sums it up perfectly. The fullness of reality must be compressed without losing color or clarity. And why is that? Well, that's because if you're too real, you're not going to be able to drive your story forward. People are going to get lost in the excesses. And by that I mean the disconnect that is a natural part of dialogue. You can hear it as I'm talking to you. You stutter, you stumble over words, you backtrack, you don't get to the point, you say things you don't mean, you get distracted. And then there's also the issue of speakers who have heavy accents or speech impediments. You want to represent those, absolutely, but you want to do it in a way that it doesn't make the reader stumble over the words on the page. So if you're writing a character who is wandering through America but is from France and speaks very little English and has an accent, then you can write that in, throw in a few words of French so that the reader starts to hear that character's voice in their head, and then as they move on through the story, pepper them in a little bit, but when they hear that character, they're going to hear that tonality, that accent. Basically, you want the feel of real, but you don't want real. This also is really important when you're talking about writing children, especially. I recently read a book with a 5-year-old in it, and he talked like a teenager. It was horrible, honestly. It made me want to throw the book across the room. But that's because he was a 5-year-old. He was your typical 5-year-old. If it had been Charles Wallace in A Wrinkle in Time, That would have been fine because that was, in fact, who he was. His characterization was in A Wrinkle in Time. Sorry, spoiler alert, if you haven't read the book, it's wonderful. You should go do that. But he's, he's brilliant. He is this essentially an adult in a child's body. That's also going to depend on your genre too. If you put dialogue in a love scene, for example, it might be very explicit, way more than people like normally say in bed. But depending on if it's an erotic romance, that might be very, very appropriate to the genre. Whereas if you're reading, one of Lee Child's Jack Reacher books, that's probably not going to be there. She might just hold out a hand and say, "Come here, Reacher," and that's the end of the love scene dialogue. So real is going to also be informed by the setting and the audience. For example, "Do you bite your thumb at me, sir?" is amazing dialogue, but it's from Romeo and Juliet. It's centuries old, and it takes place centuries ago. Nowadays, that would sound freakish. Nowadays, someone would say, "Did you just flip me off, you prick?" So you want to think about your readers and the context when you're constructing your dialogue. Think about who they are, what they've experienced in life, how they would speak, what their education and their background is. All of those things inform how your characters are going to talk. Okay, so what exactly does that mean, the feel of real? Well, it means not real, but kind of hyper real. Take a look at this scene from Release Me, and I'll explain why I'm using it as an example. So it starts with the hero. Well, the coffee is good too. He's talking about taking her out to a restaurant. The coffee is good too. I like coffee, I admit. I take a deep breath, but I don't think it's a good idea. Thousands of coffee bean growers across the globe would disagree with you. Dinner, coffee, a date with you, I don't think it's a good idea. Really? I find it exceptionally appealing. So let's dig down as to what's going on in that scene. First of all, notice that there's stutters. There's I like coffee. There's stops and starts like we have in real conversations. Dinner, coffee, a date. But we also have more than just the way that the words are presented on the page and the tone in this back and forth conversation. We also have conflict. He's trying to get her to go out. She's hesitating. We have exposition. We know that that they are sort of falling for each other, and she's pulling back. We have revelations about character. We're moving the story forward in this scene with this bit of dialogue. Whether she says yes or no, it's going to move us to the next place in this story thread. Also, keep in mind that dialogue shouldn't be on the nose. In other words, that means that we want to write with a lot of subtext. So what does that mean exactly? Well, people don't usually say what they actually mean. For example, when someone says, "What if there's no one there I know," when they're talking about going to a party? Well, they don't really mean that they are wondering if there's going to be someone there that they know. What they mean is that they're nervous about going to the party and they want someone there that they can cling to ease their nervousness. Or Han and Leia in Return of the Jedi. Leia says, "I love you." Han says, "I know." That not only is a character reveal about Han, but it's also subtext. The subtext there is that he loves her too. He's just not the kind of guy who's going to say all that, at least not easily. So when people do say exactly what they mean, the dialogue sounds wrong. You want to keep things not on the nose. So far, we've been talking about theoretical ideas in developing your dialogue. Next week, in the final chapter of this workshop, we will be talking about how to do this from a nuts and bolts perspective. We're going to get much deeper into actually creation, and I think that will wrap this up nicely. I hope to see you then. Thanks so much for joining me.